Good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to speak about the linguistic situation in Malaysia, which is, of course, quite a ride. So if we look at the map of Malaysia, we see that it has a strange shape. The peninsula on the one hand, West Malaysia, and East Malaysia consisting of two states, Sarawak and Sabah. This is, of course, the result of colonialism, as both parts became independent of Britain, and Sarawak and Sabah did not seem to be able to self-govern themselves, and so Malaysia was asked to take them in. And during this complicated process, Brunei decided not to join the community, and Singapore basically was asked to leave. And that's why we have these two small states, Brunei because it has a lot of oil and found out it would be better off without Malaysia, and Singapore because it had a majority of Chinese. This seems to have bothered Malaysia. So these two parts of the country are very different, and first I will speak more shortly about East Malaysia, and later I will go deeper into West Malaysia. Malaysia as such is a constitutional kingdom and a republic with a parliament. The king is elected among the 10 or 13 sultans, sultanates, and rajas for 5 years each. So it is an elected king. The first king was Tunku Abdul Rahman. Now, a few words to the history of the Malayan Peninsula. If you look at the map again, you see that Malaysia is in a geostrategically important position along the Strait of Malacca. And of course, this waterway is of great importance to other powers. And that's why the colonial powers took over. And that's also the reason why the history mentions a Chinese fleet coming here much earlier. So since 500 to 600 years, we can assume that in this area there are also Chinese settlers. And the Chinese empire had a strategic interest in the Strait of Malacca. And Malaysia is probably the end result of the conflict between who rules this strait versus the kingdom or empire of Majapahit, what is roughly today Indonesia. This might be the reason why the Chinese brought settlers also to Malacca. And since then, we always find a minority of roughly maybe 20% Chinese and 80% Malays in such towns such as Malacca. If you are interested in reading firsthand about this era, I would recommend the book by Thomas Newbold, 1839. If you Google that, you will find it is online. You can download it for free. And this is a very interesting account of Malacca and the British dominion. The British actually first received Penang Island and later also a small part of the mainland in West Malaysia for military aid to a sultan against the Thai advances. So the British were involved in shaping today's border with Thailand. And later, a British officer founded Singapore, and this ultimately led to the Dutch having to leave Malacca. And in this way, West Malaysia became a part of the British Empire. The Chinese profited from this development very much, as there were not only poor Chinese which came to these new places in search of work, but some businessmen also became very rich by providing the Dutch and the British armies, for example. The Chinese settlers who arrived here could count on the help of the so-called gongxi, which is often translated as companies, and which were later to be renamed huiguan, associations. One must imagine that these settlers, they came often without any possessions and would not know where to start. But they could go to the gongxi, or later huiguan, of their original place, and they would be helped with food, with a place to sleep, and with finding work. This, of course, turned out to be also very beneficial for these huiguan, which formed groups which helped each other. Many Chinese were very poor and worked as so-called coolies, for instance, in the ports. And some became very rich, as you can see still today, for example, in Penang, where is one of the many houses of Chong Fat Tse, who was a fantastically rich Hakka person back in those days. And being in Penang, there's also a Baba Nyonya Heritage Museum of a wealthy Chinese business person, which one can visit and look at these past glories. With independence, both Indonesia and Malaysia thought of ways how to diminish the influence of the Chinese, actually. And the two countries went two different ways. The Indonesians at first denied the Chinese citizenship, and actually there was an attempted genocide against the Chinese population. This is due to the fact that the Chinese in Indonesia make only below 3% of the population. In Malaysia, on the other hand, at that time, there were around 30% Chinese, not counting Singapore, and 10% Tamils. And so Malaysia decided to give them citizenship. However, after there were riots against the Chinese from the relatively poor Malays, Mr. Mahathir introduced a new state ideology, which is based on the concept of Bumiputra or Bumiputera, which mean sons of the earth. And so effectively, Malaysia introduced a system of two types of citizenships, of being either Malay or non-Malay. And the Malays received affirmative action, because it was argued that it was their relative poverty which led to such racial conflicts. Now, affirmative action is practiced in many countries of the world. If you want to read about the Malaysian situation, I recommend Thomas Sowell. I forgot the title of the book, but you would find it out. You would find out easily. Thomas Sowell is an economist who, among other countries, compares the effects of this on Malay society. The number of Chinese has been steadily decreasing in Malaysia since then. First, due to lower birth rates, and second, also by more emigration of Chinese from Malaysia. I'm sorry, I want to mention the Indians as well, but I do not know very much about this group. They are, as I said, mostly Tamils, but also a few other groups. The Malaysian state has only one national language, Malay, and one official language, English. For a long time, it completely ignored all the other languages, such as Chinese and Tamil. This made the Chinese quite independent and create their own infrastructure, first by the above-mentioned Huiguan, and then also by private schools, which have existed ever since and which became more important. And then, of course, with economic ties with Singapore and with China and many other places. Education is of high importance among the Chinese population, and the Malaysian Chinese also want to learn Chinese, which helps them get jobs in Singapore or in Singaporean companies which may send them abroad also. So quite many Malaysians are working in this way. In Indonesia and in Malaysia, the Chinese businessmen are the motor of the economy, and of course also in Singapore, where they are a majority anyway. This makes us ask the role of Chinese in society. Very often they assume the role of a middleman minority. What is that? A middleman minority is a minority whose main occupations link producers and consumers. So they are typically businessmen and so on. As an allochthonous, highly mobile, versatile minority, they are they live in urban areas and they do business as opposed to agriculturalism. A middleman minority often suffers discrimination in their country, or bullying, and but that doesn't matter that much because they are relatively wealthy. Of course, this is not true for everybody, but it's clear that many businessmen are of Chinese descent. So this is described in a number of books for history, for instance, Wang Gongwu, China and the Chinese Overseas, or it is well described in Thomas Sowell, Migrations and Cultures, and so on. Now, what about the Bumiputra? They define a Malay as speaking Malay, being member of the Islamic religion, and having Malay customs. And the Bumiputra people are entitled to certain advantages in society. And this system has been called the Malaysian New Economic Policy. Here is the book by Thomas Sowell, which also describes the situation in Malaysia, among other countries. Now, let me first go to East Malaysia and be a little bit more superficial. The first state is Sarawak. It came into being by a so-called white sultan. So the Sultan of Brunei gave power to a white person, an Englishman, who slowly extended his rule over this area. And this helped the Iban people to grow very large. So today, the Iban are the biggest ethnic group in Sarawak. In the towns along the coast, one may find also Chinese, notably Hakkas. There are, of course, also Malays, and other groups have the name Bidayu, Melanau, Orang Ulu, and smaller groups. So the percentage we see in Sarawak, 60% belong to the so-called Dayak, the indigenous people, roughly 18% are Malays and 17.5% are Chinese, and then smaller groups. You also note that in this area there are not so many Indians. Among the indigenous people, 70% are Iban. So, interestingly, English was the official language in Sarawak and not Malay for a time period after independence. And Malaysia always tries to impose Malay and forbid English in official function, but English is still spoken even in courts and in the assembly. The local dialect of Malay is called Bahasa Sarawak, and this shows us already Malay, of course, has a number of variants. Malay was not the original indigenous language of any place in Malaysia, but rather it came as a lingua franca along the coastline. It was used by many different people. In Sarawak, interestingly, half the population are Christians, and the Chinese are, you see, 30% Hakka, 30% Fuzhou, and then a sizable community of Hokkien and Cantonese. In the bigger cities, the Chinese are a majority. So the second state here is Sabah, and Sabah has more minority groups. The biggest probably being the Kadasan Dusun, and what is quite interesting here is an ethnically mixed group of Chinese or Hakka Chinese and Kadasan people, who are called the Sino-Kadasan. They, I have a picture below somewhere. I will show you later. Again, English has a different status, and in spite of the state policies in favor of Malay and against English, also the Sabahan government insists on the use of English as a lingua franca, as a main language, an official language. So let us now turn mostly to West Malaysia, which is also more densely populated and which is certainly the core area of Malaysia. And let us distinguish standard languages, which have a written form and a grammar book and so on, and spoken varieties. Interestingly, in Malaysia, there are 4 standard languages which can be written: Malay, English, Mandarin Chinese, and Tamil. But in the spoken form, Malay is spoken in so-called dialects, derived mostly from this lingua franca Malay. And what the Chinese are speaking is called, for instance, Bahasa or similar words. And instead of English, the people use the so-called Malaysian English, which is better known as Singaporean English, which has its own grammar. I will show that a little bit later. And then when people speak Chinese, they have their own way of speaking it. So a localized variety of Mandarin Chinese, which we may call Malaysian Mandarin. And then, of course, there are the heritage languages of the Chinese, such as Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien, Taishan, Hainanese, and many others. Of course, the Tamils speak spoken Tamil, which diverges from written Tamil. And then, of course, there are the indigenous languages, which we have already shortly mentioned. Furthermore, there are a few creoles, such as Cristang, which is based on Portuguese language. But these small languages are all nowadays spoken only very little and are considered endangered. Under British rule, if I may come back to historical aspects, the British were actually not eager to educate colonized populations in English or too much in general, following their experience of Islamic uprisings in India. And so actually they were careful and offered English, it seems, more to Chinese than to Malays, and created Malay schools with Malay language. This is, of course, an interesting example of language policies, where on the one hand you get education, but on the other hand you remain restricted to some national language, Malay, and don't get the global language, English. This policy actually led to the situation that many old Chinese who went to school under British rule are so-called English educated. And that means they did not learn Chinese and not much of Malay in schools. And the first language, the first elaborated language, is English. After this period, the people were forced or urged to go to Malay public schools, and they are called Malay educated because they are very good in Malay. They may not have learned Chinese, write and read Chinese, and maybe their English is not that good. And there is a third group of Chinese, those who could afford to send their children to a private Chinese school. They are called Chinese educated because their first language is Mandarin Chinese. In reading and writing, they are usually quite good in English, and they also learned Malay. That means it is not clear from the beginning, if you meet a Malaysian Chinese, what is his strong language and which language he may not know that well. Of course, after independence, Malaysia, as you can also see from the name, attempted to become a nation state with this ideal of one nation, one national language. This cannot possibly work out with such strong other groups in society. Their language policies first attempted to get rid of English and move to Malay education only. This, of course, broke somehow the tradition of learning good English, and the so-called Malaysian English, a local spoken variety, became probably stronger. So an English transmitted outside of school. And that's why some people have called this a semi-Creole, a half-Creole English. Later, the Malaysian policies also included English again, and it is now an official language. You can learn both Chinese and English now also in public schools. You get education in Chinese and in English. That's what I must say here. There are very many publications about the language policies in Malaysia, so this is a very much discussed topic in applied linguistics. You will easily find literature for that. And for this Malaysian English, maybe a good basis is the book Languages in Contact by John Horn, which also discusses the status of Malaysian English. Malaysian English is a non-ethnic identity marker for Malaysians. And that's why, for example, there exists this funny cartoon series, which you can buy in every bookshop, Like that also Kana. And you see, this is not standard English. This is the so-called Malaysian English, and the dialogues in these books are written in this language. The Chinese private schools are well funded and very beautiful and have a high standard of education, but they are not recognized by the state, and so you don't get the university entrance exam. If you want that, you need to sit for an extra exam. And if you don't, basically, you cannot become a civil servant and so on. Nonetheless, this Chinese infrastructure is alive and well. In olden times, Newbold, the old book which I mentioned in the beginning, reports that the level of learning in Chinese schools was very low. This is no longer true. These schools are doing very well today. The earliest settlers of Chinese descent in Malaya were, of course, mostly men who married Malay women. And they are today called Peranakan in Malay. And they have the nickname Baba Nyonya, which means like grandmother, grandfather, grandmother. And they actually did no longer speak Chinese over the centuries, but spoke an ethnolect of Malay, which is called Baba Malay. This language is now set to die out as well with old speakers. But when you look at the grammar, you need not worry. Baba Malay is not very different from spoken colloquial Malay. So this language simply returned to the colloquial Malay spoken by everybody. Many of these families in the meantime shifted to speaking Hokkien in the case of Penang, or Chinese again. So they have a separate culture. They do not feel as Malays, and so they are more on the Chinese side culturally. As I said, Malay actually came as a lingua franca. So it was not the first language of many people. It was a second language. And so obviously it must have had many influences from other languages, notably from Chinese. And we have investigated this mostly during the last year. And we wrote a paper in a book which has appeared only recently, and we call this Ethnolects and Registers in Spoken Malaysian, and showing that the various groups speak roughly the same language, but show certain differences in grammar and word choice, which makes you recognize from which group they are. And so this has to be termed an ethnolect. I cannot tell anything about the Tamils in Malaya because I lack personal information about them just so much. There are around 10% of the population speak Tamil language. What is most interesting in Malaysia, perhaps, is not only that there are many spoken languages, but that there are at least 3 standard languages of relevance. I exclude here Tamil, which is restricted to the Tamil population. The other people know English and Malay. The Chinese also know Chinese. And many Malays nowadays try to learn Chinese as well. So these standard languages are widespread in Malaysia. The heritage languages, so the languages spoken in the families, are currently mostly lost below the age 20 group. So we see currently a language shift away from, for instance, Hokkien and Hakka and so on, to Mandarin, Malaysian Mandarin as the spoken form. So why does this happen? Why don't Chinese just assimilate to becoming Malay speakers? I would think that this is more difficult in Malaysia than it would be in Thailand, for instance, because of the Bumiputra ideology and this sharp divide between Muslim Malays and other people. So that's why probably the minorities who can afford that will maintain their own identity. The entire time we have spoken actually about so-called allochthonous languages. Malay came from outside, Chinese came from outside, English came from outside. So they are not indigenous languages, they are allochthonous. The autochthonous groups are nowadays very small. As I said, Malaysia is in a geostrategically very important position, and so these big cities were most relevant in history, and this is where Malay was naturally spoken, and Chinese and English. Just as a side information, the Tamils are maybe called, at least earlier in time, Kling, and this word comes from Kalinga, which is another word for the Tamil people in India. Nowadays, people believe that this term is pejorative. It's a dysphemism, like Negro for a black person, and so they wouldn't use it anymore. But I found the history of the word quite interesting. It simply means Kalinga. However, if you have a dysphemism for a group, what you can see from that is that the Tamils are relatively less wealthy. There is a stereotype that they are drinking too much alcohol as a constant joke in comedy and so on. And they clearly are the weaker group in society. What we have focused most here, and which I assume also most important, is this urban situation of an allochthonous multilingualism, a multilingualism of languages which are not the languages of the country. So we are not speaking about traditional minorities living in certain geographical areas. Settlers settle basically everywhere. So these languages are spread out across the whole country. Singapore is a very similar, completely different neighbor. First of all, they have a Chinese majority, but a strict equality policy for the three main groups, Chinese, Malays, and Tamils. And the state policies with respect to language included a Speak Mandarin campaign, which was targeted against the so-called Chinese dialects, Fangyan, I mean Hokkien, Hakka, Cantonese. And the people indeed did give up speaking these languages. And then the Speak Good English movement, which targeted Singaporean English, and which wanted to introduce standard English as it is spoken in other countries. Especially the second movement led to some sociocultural resistance because Singaporean English, as much as Malaysian English, is a marker of identity, and the people love to speak like that. So this language did not disappear. Nonetheless, we can see that with higher education, with more education in English, also Singaporean English and Malaysian English get closer to standard English over time. Okay. there is a lot of literature about Singaporean English and about their language policies. Singapore is considered in the outer circle of English, whereas Malaysia is considered to be in the expanding circle. So it is not, Malaysia is not officially a English-speaking country in the world. Now, let us first come to Standard Malay. Standard Malay has some amount of Austronesian grammar, especially a larger number of verb affixes, which are roughly I just choose two, me and di, and me is added to verbs which we would consider transitive in syntax. So if I say I bought a house, you say saya telah menjual rumahku. And you see there is some amount of morphology in the standard language. You can turn the sentence around in a kind of passive, in reality is a resultative form. Rumah sudah dijual, the house already sold. So this is one aspect of the grammar. If you look at the spoken forms, such as Baba Malay, the language of the Baba Nyonya, who are an estimated group of ethnic group in Malaysia, the language does not use these many morphological affixes, so it is a simplified morphology. It also includes Hokkien words, for example, pronouns, and the verbs are affixless more often than not. Yeah. So maybe we can read this here. This is a joke on the internet. It's not real language, but it is authentic. So here a person comes to a shop and says, "Ape kopi o kau satu." And now you see the first word, "ape," is Hokkien. Kopi is Malay, but kopi o means black coffee, and that is actually Hokkien black. And kau is thick. Satu again is Malay. So this spoken Malay is very much influenced by other languages. Maybe I don't read everything now here. That takes too long. And you find such words everywhere, for instance, in this coffee shop chain, bungkus kau. So a Hokkien word in colloquial Malay. The Malay that the Chinese are speaking, they are aware is not standard Malay, so it's called Bahasa Malay or Bahasa Bahasa. And to give you a feeling for that, this would be standard Malay. If you say, he got scolded by the boss. Got scolded, that's a kind of passive. So you say, dia dimarahi oleh bosnya. But the Chinese would say, dia kena marah sama dia punya bos. And what you find here is an analytic formation with a Malay auxiliary and a different preposition and an analytic formation of the possession, like ta de laoban. And because it's a spoken language, there is some amount of variation. For instance, you can use different prepositions, and it may have a slight sociopragmatic difference. Tells you something about the speaker, so to say. If we compare spoken Malay spoken by the Malays, we find the same analytic formation. Kereta saya kena langgar instead of the morphology of standard Malay, dengan kereta lain. So that is very interesting. Both the Malays and the Chinese people speak a spoken Malay which is morphologically simplified and most probably reflects the old lingua franca as opposed to the more traditional, more old-fashioned standard Malay that has been created for the standard language. Interestingly, if you have Chinese sentences, for instance, here Hakka, nga cha, my car, bun nginga, give people, tong dao, was hit, and bun, to give, in the function of a passive marker, if you like. And they would use exactly the same construction in Malay by using kasi, give, orang, give people. So we can see in many, many examples all over the place how the Chinese languages have actually influenced the spoken Malay. And the Malays reported that they perfectly understand this sentence, but the younger people wouldn't use it. So these are the tiny differences in usage in the spoken Malay between the ethnic groups, but they know each other's language. And that's why I said previously, there are ethnolects of Malay. So in all these urban centers, such as Kuala Lumpur, there is an urban koine. Koine is the Greek word for the fact when different dialects come together and form one colloquial kind of spoken standard. And it is reported in the literature that they often use affixless verbs. So in a first glance, one might think, did they lose the morphology that we find in standard Malay? It is the other way around. Malay lost all these affixes in spoken form, and then only much later, standard Malay was formed after the image of an earlier state of the language. And this created the standard Malay, which is not part of the areal type of languages in Malaysia. So in standard Malay, you should say, saya telah menjual rumahku, I have sold the house. And you can say the house has been sold, rumah sudah dijual. But in spoken language, it is absolutely acceptable to say, saya jual rumah, and rumah sudah jual. So there is no marker for these states of the verb in spoken language. And this, of course, is just as it is in Sinitic languages. And then the same speaker might say, aku kena marah, so an analytic passive with kena, I got scolded by father. Or they might say, aku dimarahi ayah, in the standard Malay form. So here we find a grammatical difference which can be freely chosen, and this is the variation inside of the language. In some cases, the speakers refuse to use the analytic form, but with English loanwords, they don't fit into the morphological pattern of Malay. They always use the analytical form. So they may say, my car got repaired, kereta saya kena repair. Yeah? Or the house was sanitized, rumah kena sanitize. Malay is also full of English words, spoken Malay especially. So as I said, we find here in our analysis ethnolectal differences in the use of spoken Malay, and spoken Malay is considerably different from the standard Malay that people learn at school. Now, quickly to the Chinese in Malaysia. The Chinese immigrants who arrived in Nanyang in Southeast Asia spoke Chinese South Sinitic languages. So mostly Hokkien and then Hakka and Cantonese. Because they were close to the ports from where they could travel. You know that there are Chinese nowadays everywhere across the globe because China is a huge country with a huge population. And so, of course, a certain amount of Chinese will move to other places. So there is this proverb, Hai Shui, Dao Chu, You Huaran. So where there is an ocean, there are also Chinese. The first historically noted contact between China and what is today Malaya or Malacca at that time is the Admiral Zheng He or Cheng Ho, who lived in the 15th century. And he is said to have brought a number of Chinese to Malacca. So it was important for the Chinese strategically to strengthen this place in the Strait of Malacca, especially against the Empire of Majapahit down here. And you see, that was an age of exploration for the Chinese. Zheng He went until Africa, actually, at that time, with his fleet. After that, the Chinese decided not to go outside that much and stopped doing so. And this gave way to European colonialism. I mentioned before, many Chinese came to the colonial places, Batavia, Indonesia, and Malacca, and later Singapore, and usually or very often were very successful economically. They brought with them their own languages, and you must be aware that in olden times, there was no standard Chinese. And so these people did not understand each other when coming from different groups. And this, of course, made it even more useful for them to belong to certain Gongxi or Huiguan and remain with their own group of people. So for this reason, their place of origin remains very important. If we look at the total numbers of Chinese, we see there are 2 million Hokkien-speaking people, 1 million Hakkas, 1 million Cantonese, 500,000 Teochew, and so on. There is a number of publications nowadays of why these languages are now in decline, but it's very clear with general education and much more education for the young people. They rely on the mass media and our culture depending very much on the written word. The young people are, of course, primed to use Chinese, Malay, and English, and not so much the much less documented languages such as Hakka. Before this decline happened, however, the people needed to get along with each other, lacking a shared language. And since the Sinitic languages are very similar, the people usually learned each other's languages and became multilingual speakers. We have described this in a number of publications because specifically when people speak the same languages all the time, a convergence phenomena will happen, and there will be a convergence between the languages. And this is what we have documented over the last few years very much. To give you one example, first, there are very many loan words in the Sinitic languages, and second, they almost always have exactly the same grammar, partly because they are closely related, partly because they live together and know each other's languages. So this sentence is, I go with you in your car to Penang. That is the meaning. And you can say in Hakka, Ngai tumbang ngie cha go pinsang. Tumbang, of course, is Malay. It has the meaning to catch a ride. You might say Ngai cho ngia cha go pinsang. So I sit your car, cross Penang. Or you can say Ngai ken ngia cha go pinsang. I follow your car. And when you look at the Malaysian English construction, it is exactly the same. I tumbang your car to Penang, or I follow your car to Penang. Now, if you are an English speaker from any other region in the world, you don't easily understand this. It doesn't mean I follow you. It means I ride with you in your car. So one must be careful. The word follow has a different meaning in Malaysian English. And these words, follow, tumbang, to, and so on, can be exchanged. So it's really what the people call a language salad, a language mix, bahasa rojak. As if there is a pool of words from various languages which you can exchange with each other in all of these languages. So that's the interesting situation. Let me look at another language, Cantonese. They would say, Ngo lung bong le ke che guo pineng. Sorry for my pronunciation. So again, it has the same syntactic structure. It uses the same loan word, tumbang. It just replaces the Hakka pronouns with the Cantonese pronouns and pronunciation between the two. Hokkien is usually a little bit more different in phonology. It also uses the word tumbang. And in Malaysian Mandarin, you could, of course, also use it, so spoken standard Chinese, wo tumbang ni de che gu binzhen, chu binzhen, sorry, or guo binzhen. And the Chinese would, of course, say, that would be the same mostly. This is standard Chinese. Of course, tumbang could be replaced by gun. So this may serve as only one example. We have collected many such examples and analyzed them carefully, where this choice of the main verb is very interesting, and especially in English leads to an interesting construction where the English verb has actually acquired a different semantics from standard English. And this shows you clearly when I speak of Malaysian English, I don't mean English, I mean Malaysian English. That's a different grammar. Very many English words have been borrowed to all the other languages, whatever it is. So you would say in Hakka, the meaning is the mechanic said that the original engine and spare parts are no longer available. If you want to have it repaired, reconditioned parts will be replaced instead, okay? So how would the Hakka say? Formen gong mao yen zonge enzin. Here you must continue. Tung spepa toy, oi chang chiu oi yung rekonge. So I hope you find the English words, recon, foreman, engine, yeah, spepat, yeah. The syntax and the function words and so on are Hakka. You can do the same for Cantonese. They would say go foreman, gong mo, yun chong ge engine, and so on. Exactly the same situation. So this is Bahasa Rojak, the language mix, where the people think they speak a mixed language. It is not a mixed language in linguistic terms, but it is very interesting how the different lexicons and the languages of the spoken grammars, spoken language grammars, interact. And as I said, we did this with more than 50 sentences and attempted to get speakers of the various languages and give us their take. And of course, with a little bit of variation, but it is quite stable. We get these loan words. They are fully integrated in this pool of Semitic languages. Another example, Kostan, you would not recognize immediately. That means to reverse a car. And this is the old English word go astern, a word which I wouldn't have known. I learned it only in this way, to reverse a car. Or the brakes, brick. Huh? And then, of course, these South Semitic family languages influence the way Standard Chinese is spoken today. So, for instance, if somebody says, I think there are at least a few thousand people, and you don't really believe that. In Chinese, you would say Chunama or Yoma, but in Malaysia, the people say something like Yo Mayo. So, this is how Chinese would immediately recognize a Malaysian Chinese speaker. This is heavily influenced by Cantonese Hakka, Hokkien. Let me move over to English. If you have immediately questions, you might interrupt me, but otherwise I push you through all these many languages quickly. I will speak about English on another day in more detail. For the moment, I give you only a few examples to make you understand that this is really a separate kind of language, the spoken form of Malaysian English. It has been discussed very nicely in John Platt's publication already in the 70s, as you can see. Especially on, sometimes on Singlish. It really makes no difference. It is the same with Malaysian English. Here, English in Singapore and Malaysia, a whole book. And we have discussed also the lower register forms, specifically of Malaysian English, and attempted to classify that. Now, I said before, it has been called a semi-Creole or a Creoloid. So it's not really a Creole language. It lacks some of the quality, some of the characteristics, but it is close to a Creole actually. Maybe I show you just a little bit from real life, from social media. So there is this funny photo, and people say, show okay, see okay, touch cannot. That is not standard English, but this is the way people speak in Malaysia. Or here, betul betul, so immediately switch over to Malay. Here's a report of Singaporean monks misbehaving, and people write, already got fake taxi, now this is fake monk. So already got, that is very much Singaporean or Malaysian English. Yeah. Not only in Singapore, other countries also, some of them gamble. You see, the syntax of the spoken language follows a topic comment structure as in Chinese. Is the pronoun is missing. So if want to gamble, don't go to temple. Yeah. Or here, there's a very long expiry date, and the person comments, "Oh, 2-year expire, no plural. Don't worry, can slow consume." Reduplication in English. Okay. And then the company is Gardenia Boleh. There is a slogan, Malaysia Boleh, Malaysia can do it. So here's Malay word. Buy more, no need to go out, MCO, restrict our movement during COVID times. Yeah. And then again, some Sinitic and Malay, you see, mixed together. Here, because I have shown you the auxiliary kana, maybe we can read this moderately funny comment on the internet. I kana lockdown. I got locked down. Yeah. When I got married and so on. Won't go anywhere, must declare and so on. So this is not standard English. And when the Speak Good English campaign in Singapore was active, then you can make a joke about this, and maybe you can read this, I don't know. Abang, a name. Why your government say no talks English anymore? Yeah. So here also the orthography is distorted. Are you so putting? Yeah. Nem mind, that means never mind. Nem mind la, next time. You want to talk, call me on my handphone. Yeah. Or maybe this joke is quite funny for a Malaysian. I will explain. When your friend Cheng Ho, same name as the admiral, yeah, promised to tapao. Tapao is Malay for takeaway. Some laksa. Laksa is a food, but comes back without it. You call him laksa mana Cheng Ho. Mana means where. So where's the laksa Cheng Ho? And why is it funny? Because in Malay, laksa mana means admiral. So it refers to this famous admiral Cheng He. So that's the way of making fun in Malaysian English. And you can see this language is in full use, and it is an identity marker for Malaysian citizens. I stop here because it may get too hard to read so many examples for you. Yeah? If you look at dialogues in Malaysian English, let's just look at it. What do you want to eat? Whatever. People say, what do you want to eat? What also can la? Now, what does that mean? What also can and a particle la. This means whatever. How did they come to say what also can? Now, if you compare with Chinese, it is shema, what? Do is always translated as also, 可以, can. So actually, this is a copy of Chinese syntax into English. Yeah. They would say, he wants to know everything. Everything also he wants to know. Now look at Chinese. 什么都要打听. So everything also. 什么都. This is exactly the way Chinese functions. So we can confidently say that Malaysian English is heavily influenced by Chinese. It's a Chinese way of speaking English. There was a McDonald's ad in Singapore. Everything also want. In Chinese, 什么都要. I chose only one example how a Chinese function word translates into Malaysian English function word. You can do this all day long with all structures in Malaysian English. We already had the word already, or sudah in Malay, or liao, and so on in Chinese languages. And they have exactly the same grammatical meaning in every single language in Malaysia. My car sell already la. So they don't say sold, they say sell. The L, of course, disappears. And already is the translation of the le in Chinese languages. So the car has been sold. My car sell already. I have seen it already. I see liao. So you can say I see and add the Chinese function word liao in the same function as already above. I have seen it already. So you can see from these examples, this is not English. This is a separate variety with its own grammar. Maybe we just read for fun this example 29, so you get an understanding of how much Malaysian English differs from English. Just now, the big lorry is so slow until be dahan. Hokkien cannot. Dahan, I cannot stand it in Malay. So and until is a translation of Chinese dao, the verb, secondary verb dao. So just now the big lorry is so slow until be dahan. So he was going so slow and I couldn't stand it anymore. Then I overtake law. How I know got police in front. Then kena saman la. Kena saman, I was fined. A passive construction with Malay words in English. 300 cannot ra yuan, Chinese. Yeah. So this is how the people speak with each other. I must say on this point, it is difficult for a foreigner to hear this because the people may adapt to the foreigner and not use these forms. So they would use them only with listeners who are actually able to understand. And this again brings us back to this interesting case of lexical choice. They can choose words or exchange words in the same slot all the time, independent of who they're talking to. We spoke about kasih orang and punginga, so give people as a passive construction. It is possible in Malaysian English to say he give people hit, which means he was hit by somebody. And give people, of course, is this punginga, gairan construction in Chinese. So what we could say here, as a more theoretical point, Malaysian English is very much like the grandchild of China Coast Pidgin. In olden times, around Hong Kong and so on, the Chinese learned English, and that was somewhat similar to this kind of speaking because it was in English, heavily influenced by Chinese structure. And this China Coast Pidgin disappeared, is no longer spoken by anybody. But here again, Chinese speakers seem to have shaped this kind of speaking English when people learn English outside of school and just apply their grammatical competence on a new language. And this leads you to such a grammar. In Chinese, there is not so much a subject-verb-object structure as, this also is there, of course, as there is topic prominence. So the most important element comes first, and then comes the SVO structure. And we can see this also in English. You can say the neutral sentence, my mother made this cake. Okay. You can also say, this cake, my mother made one. Now, that is not standard English. How did they come along with that structure? It is, of course, a copy of the Chinese structure. In Chinese, you would say, 这个蛋糕我妈妈做的. And you can put the topic, 这个蛋糕, and then you have this well described, oft discussed construction, 是我妈妈做的. So the 是的 construction, or the alone, doesn't matter. And what is this the? It is a relation marker. It has a very wide range of functions. And it turns out in Malaysian English, it is always translated at one. So this grammatical function word is fully in place in Malaysian English. Now, let's leave Malaysian English to another day. I cannot speak about Tamil, but maybe I mention shortly the autochthonous languages to you, which means the traditionally spoken languages of the people in the country. And these people are called Sakai, which may sound a little bit pejorative. The official term today is Orang Asli, which would translate as original people, so the native people of the country. And today they live mostly in the highlands of West Malaysia, and they speak Mon Khmer languages. This is some picture from the internet, but we have also visited them. I just didn't have the time to look for our own pictures. The grammars of these languages are partially well described, and many are not described or not well described. One very extensive grammar is this one, Nicole Kruspe, a grammar of Sumulai. Sumulai is one of the languages there. Geoffrey Benjamin in Singapore wrote about many languages, about Standard Malay as much as about autochthonous languages. Here's an overview, Aslian, by James Matisoff, a famous Sino-Tibetan scholar. And if you want to know about language endangerment, maybe I refer to Paolo Colucci, University Malaya, who is concerned with that, vitality of minority languages. Here, Geoffrey Benjamin, the Aslian languages of Malaysia and Thailand. So, and Thailand, of course, these languages extend into Thailand, and these are the places where you may still find speakers. In the plains, they usually don't speak their own language anymore. Mameri is seriously endangered, I believe. But when you go into this area, you can find Samay, Tamyar villages, and the people nowadays also know Malay, but they still speak their own language. In spite of this huge area, these are not that many people. Their historical affiliation, as you can see, they belong to an older layer of languages in Southeast Asia, with Khmer and Vietic as their biggest brothers. I just excerpted a few examples from Kruspe's grammar, so that one may get some idea about it. They have this characteristic sesquisyllables when speaking about the phonological structure. So, and they have an agent marker, so they are partially ergative languages. You see they have some amount of morphology, so they are more complex than all the languages we saw so far. And they have a position-dependent case marking system, which is interesting to me. I'm interested in case marking systems. It is VSO, the verb in the beginning, or free word order. And in some situations, there's no case marking at all. So that's almost a separate system of case marking. Maybe I don't torture you with going into more detail here. Just to show a few examples how this language seems to sound. There come on a lot of such consonant clusters. In Sarawak and Sabah, I've mentioned already, there are many more languages. I don't know much about them, I must say. Bidayu, Iban, Kadasan, Dusun, these are the most, the best known names. I mentioned already the mix of Chinese and Kadasan people. Here's an image. This is a Hakka speaker from Sabah, and this is also a Hakka speaker from Sabah. And ethnically, he looks different because he is a Sino-Kadasan. So his family is a mix of Chinese and Kadasan people, but his family line goes back to the area of Shenzhen. There are also other inter-ethnic marriages, for instance, the so-called Chindians, when Chinese and Indian people marry. And this happens quite often nowadays in Malaysia. And linguistically, they end up being English speakers, because for Chinese it's probably difficult to learn Tamil, and Tamils may not learn Chinese. So English is the common denominator for these people. The Sino-Kadasan, on the other hand, they became Hakka speakers. And half of them speak Hakka, half of them speak Kadasan language, you could say. In Sabah, if you listen to music, you can quickly find here's a song mostly in Hakka, but with Kadasan in between, Aanangan Tsokoso, and here's the translation, Wohan Sihuan, I like her. Or here, He local gay product. She is a local product, a love song. Yeah? So with Kadasan, with English mixed in, this is the way people speak in Malaysia all the time. This is a Hakka pop song. This leads, I'm already finished. I'm a little bit too early now, but maybe we have plenty of time to discuss, and probably you didn't understand everything I said because I was too fast. I'm happy to repeat or to explain again. I have to stop here now because my script is finished. Thank you very much. Please feel free to comment.
Okay, thank you so much, Ajahn Pathama.
Thank you, Professor Roft, for your insightful talk. And again, many examples. I'm fascinated by your examples. I just would like you to comment or give me a little bit more elaboration on affirmative action. This action in Malaysia, did it yield positive or negative to the local people? Thank you so much.
Oh, yes, I'm happy to oblige. So affirmative action is actually a big problem in general in all countries of the world. It is not a good thing because it is the dispensation of equality, the opposite of equality. I mentioned Thomas Sowell's book, which I recommend you to read. If you want, I can give it to you, by the way. It describes around the world, including Malaysia, that affirmative action never reaches the goal that was intended. So specifically, affirmative action in Malaysia means not so much that Malays get an advantage, but rather that all the non-Malays get disadvantages, such as they have to pay more for housing. And a poor Chinese in Malaysia doesn't get help from the government, and a rich, a wealthy Malay gets 7% off the price of a house. Yeah? And this leads to sociocultural troubles, such as you may get the advice, go to a Chinese doctor, not to a Malay doctor, because a Malay doctor got his degree more easily. So he may not be good. This may be a prejudice, but this is where affirmative action leads to. And that is quite well documented, actually. So affirmative action is not a good thing, in my opinion. And that's why also I mentioned Thomas Sowell, who speaks out against this very much. And in the case of Malaysia, it is embedded in this Bumiputra state ideology. And one cannot but say this is basically a racist law because it makes distinction between ethnic groups.
Thank you very much. And I have got another question because you gave us so many examples, and the examples that I liked most, they were from social media. And then you clearly show how the language has been used in social media. And I just wondering, because you also gave examples of a dialogue of a mixed or a salad language. So I just wonder what about the data collection process. How did you get those kind of data? Because the social media, they are easily we are easily be able to get it online, but for the dialogue thing, how did you get up your set up your a data collection process? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. This is a very important, very good question, because as I said, the people might not speak with me in that way. And actually, I found in the literature and in the reports by other researchers, they often take, data from their own students at the University of Singapore and so on. But these are already highly educated people, and their Singaporean English is not as radically different from English as our data sometimes are. So basically, I could not get such data either. That's true. But it's because of my co-author, my wife, Sundathui, who is a proficient speaker of Hakka, Chinese, Cantonese, Malay, and English. And she can interact with people and makes recordings of interactions. I also sometimes make the recording while the family people, for instance, are interacting. And most of these recordings are then not useful, but sometimes you get wonderful examples of how they interact in 4 or 5 languages in very few seconds. And this is where we get our data from. So it is participant observation, first in the family, then among friends, and increasingly with other people. Furthermore, we started asking people with some kind of questionnaire, for instance, Malay, ethnic Malay people. We did this even in Austria, not even in Malaysia partly, with students and so on. And we explained to them carefully that we are not interested in whether they can speak standard Malay, but we would rather want to know, how would you say to your grandmother? How would you speak to somebody in the market? And some people can imagine that situation and then start giving you such examples. So that is slightly artificial, I agree. But it's a matter of how much do you believe that this is okay. And we had a lot of fun with many people. They were easygoing. If they are highly educated, they may hesitate a little bit more with such structures. But in the end, often agree that yes, they hear such phrases all the time. So basically, I'm relying on my co-author, my wife, Sundet Phui, who can also evaluate this data and say, yeah, this is how I heard it all my life.
That is amazing because it's very difficult to get like a authentic data. And can I just ask you like a follow-up questions? And what do you think about collecting data from fictions? Because fictions at some point in the dialogue, they are sort of authentic. What do you think about fiction data?
Yes, this may probably is possible, sure. Yes. I had never tried that. It just came to my mind now that when I did Tibetan grammar, I read about the interesting aspect that, classical Tibetan is very different from spoken Tibetan, but whenever they had direct speech, even in old books, then the grammar was very close to how Tibetan is spoken today. So actually that is in this case, this is a proof that the spoken language didn't change that much. It doesn't come from the classical language. It coexisted all the time. So that's what came to my mind now. But I'm sure, yes, I'm wondering whether you can get enough data from fiction to have a big enough database. What we also did, if I may add this, we started out by transcribing a lot from our recordings, and only then we looked at the transcripts. So we have a wealth of data, but then, of course, only a few very vivid examples inside.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you for other people. Are you have any comment, or you can share your work or your interesting topic? This time for discussion is if anyone would like to discuss or ask any question, please. Ajahn Samrak, Ajahn Sarawat, or the other people. Okay.
Okay. So I would like to ask the question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. One of my PhD student, she would like to do about Baba Nonya in Thailand, and she would like to record or do about the language. But because of the Peranakan in Thailand is like they cannot speak Chinese anymore. So I mean, what in terms of the language or the ethnology that we would like to collect, what is your suggestion in case that I mean a lot of different gap between the different generation, like the grandma still can speak ethnology, but the grandson or granddaughter they cannot speak anymore. Yeah. So what can you suggest for the methodology to collect the language or the ethnology? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I did not actively collect from Peranakan. First of all, there are 2 or 3 grammatical descriptions of Baba Malay. Is this important to you? I drew my examples here mostly from, I believe, Lee. Huala Ning Lee is the name of this author. Please send me an email and I give you the literature and everything I know about that. Our method is basically we go to many places and try to talk to people. And, you know, some people you cannot derive much information and sometimes you get a lot. And we are just always ready to record. We have some ideas in our mind, what we want to know. And if it goes well, we will push in that direction. And you can only basically collect the language of the old people. As I said, I am very much profiting from the fact that my wife is a fully competent speaker of several languages, especially Hakka. She understands most dialects. So she approaches people like an equal, and they have a lot of fun with each other. And afterwards, she can really explain what is the language of these people. And that's why I'm doing this research, basically, because when I was alone doing research on, for example, Tibetan, it was much more difficult for me to even get any data or to figure out what it means, because I could barely understand this dialect. What can I say about it? So I hesitated very much writing about the data that I collected. And so I would say one needs a good native speaker who can help with the evaluation of the data. Maybe.
Yeah, because in fact, my student, she is, she's the insider. She is the descendant of the Peranakan. So, she quite sure that she can get the language or the conversation. But in terms of analytical, should we let her analyze as the sentence as you just give us the information, like compare the Thai language or compare the Southern Thai and then compare the Thai Nonya or something like that? Or is in case of Malaysia, because we already read about the Peranakan and they usually identify the Chinese Peranakan in Malaysia like only the Hokkien and the Tajiu. They didn't mention about the Hakka. But in fact, in the southern part of Thailand, there are also many Hakka also. So I'm not quite sure that if we identify like the ethnology, so maybe they have several kind of ethnology among themselves. Something like that. This just would like to discuss more.
Yeah, thank you. That is extremely interesting. As I said, we did not approach Peranakan speakers very much. Maybe this has to do because they are usually of Hokkien descent. And Hokkien might be the language my wife understands least. First of all, the Peranakan in Malaysia in centuries ago switched to Malay, but they speak their own ethnolect of Malay, which is known as Baba Malay. I wouldn't say it is a separate language. It is similar enough that the Malay speaker might understand. Yeah? And in modern times, it seems they switched to Chinese or to Hokkien. And to Hokkien because, for instance, in Penang, Hokkien is just dominant. Every Hakka speaker understands Hokkien. And Hokkien influences, for example, Hakka in this area. Yeah. Now, the Peranakan in Thailand, I do not know much about that. Are they in the south of Thailand, or are we speaking about Bangkok? Do you mean Phuket or?
Only in the south, because I think they might migrate from the mining industry. So they come from Penang or come from Indonesia and Malaysia also.
I see. We have been to Phuket last year, and we have looked for traces of Hakka mostly, I must say. We met people who were able to speak Cantonese, and the situation was as usual. The old lady was native speaking. What was this kind of nephew? He spoke Cantonese to some degree, and the woman did not. She spoke Thai only. So you have the same pattern all the time. That's all I know. If your student has family, I think is a good way, participant observation in the family, then she has first-class access to natural linguistic environment. And then, of course, one may interview people with the questions that one has. So I like very much to observe only without interfering to get spontaneous data. I don't try to get very exotic data. I try to get the data how people really are speaking, whatever it is. I like that. But then also, of course, we have to ask. And then, of course, I have to look into the literature, what is written about it. I would choose this multifaceted approach and try to gather all the information. I cannot tell you one particular way of doing it. Yeah, it's a qualitative research, not quantitative. We also tried to use questionnaires, and it worked to some degree, but not very well. And questionnaires are very rough information because you ask people, do you know this language? This is yes or no. We tried to have a scale from 1 to 5 or something. But this is not, I don't like such information too much. I prefer the qualitative dialogues and interviews and so on for gathering information. I'm afraid it is a lot of work.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you that I also prefer the qualitative because at first my student also would like to do the questionnaire, and I saw her questionnaire and I think it's not helped too much. Yeah.
If one has enough people, one can do a questionnaire, but there are several problems. First of all, many people don't return the questionnaire. And second, many people didn't understand our linguistic questions well enough. So we ended up sitting with the people and filling out the questionnaire for them. So my wife would ask in Hakka, how do you think? How good is your Hakka? And then she noted it down like that. And also for your student, I think one might think of a theoretical side of the question. So in this case, probably it is a matter of language shift or language abandonment when the language is given up by the next generation. And what might be the reasons for that? So this should be, I believe, the theoretical side.
Okay, thank you. Next, Sasravut.
Good morning, Professor. I have one question about the linguistic landscape and the linguistic landscape, the relationship between linguistic landscape and the ethnic identity. Because like in Malaysia, is the multilingualism society. So I wonder how they express or they relate their ethnic identity to the linguistic landscape, because like in Thailand, especially in the deep south of Thailand, the Patani Malay speakers, they tie their ethnic identity and religious identity to the to the Jawi script. So I wonder this kind of situation happened in Malaysia.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, I think because of government policies, the ethnic identity of the different groups remains quite important. Could you switch off your microphone for a moment? Because I can hear myself. Okay, thank you. Remains very important, and of course the Chinese and the Tamils have a strong ethnic identity from their homelands already, and so they keep up this identity. And reversely, it is practically not possible to assimilate to Malay culture. They cannot become Malays like everybody else, because there is this religious and cultural and political divide. Yeah? And migrants in general tend to be very much interested in their origin, which also enhances the interest in an ethnic identity, I would say. We must say that beside the Peranakan, the historical depth is not so deep. The majority of the Chinese, for instance, came in the course of the 20th century. So usually the people are 4th, 5th generation. So it's not so far away. And they may have relatives in China, for example, and relate back to that. There are many, in connection to languages, the Chinese, of course, they have a layered identity. First, they are Hakkas or Hokkien, and not even that, they come from Chaiyang County. They come from a specific county in somewhere in China. And the Huiguan usually refers to a smaller entity, a smaller geographical region inside of China, not to Hakka-ness. And I think an identity such as Hakka is maybe often a more modern phenomenon, because that wasn't really a thing in earlier times. This shows that this identity becomes, the origin of this identity is now more coarse. It's not the village where you're from, but the greater idea of, yes, we are Hakkas. And then, of course, they also feel Chinese. And in Malaysia, they say they are Malaysians. So I observe this all the time. When my wife is asked where she's from, she says Malaysia. She doesn't say I'm Chinese. And she may explain later. So identity anyway is a very complex phenomenon, and it is not clear. There is I didn't see conflict between people in the street. They are all friendly to each other. What is interesting is the choice of language, a little bit delicate. Because, for instance, when you go to an Indian shop, you're not sure whether this person speaks good English. So if you speak English, maybe this person may feel bad. So you try to speak very simple Malay first. And only after you get an answer, you get better insight which type of language you may use with that person. So that was interesting, but it is difficult to describe. What can I tell you? I see things, I must say, mostly from the Chinese perspective, of course, because most of my contacts are Chinese descent, and we focus mostly on the Hakkas. As I said, some Hakkas, I know, they don't speak Hakka or they don't speak Cantonese and prefer English because they were English educated. So this is but they are from the same family. So it's very complicated. So part of the family, they all speak English, and a part of the family speaks Hakka all the time, except for the young people. They speak Chinese. And I think it is not a very ideological matter for the normal people. Of course, if you ask somebody, who are you? They will answer something. But this is not a daily topic for the people. They just know, yeah, the family neighbors are Hokkien, and that's it.
And how about the language attitude towards language and English language? Which language is better, their attitude towards these two languages?
I didn't get it was a little bit bad sound. Could you repeat the question?
Okay. I wonder, especially in the ethnic minority people in Malaysia, about their language attitudes towards English and Malay. Which language is better in attitudes?
The Malays certainly prefer Malay, and may have to do with the language policy of the country. They put Malay first, no? But they are usually able to speak English, and the Chinese show a demonstrative disinterest in Malay very often, with the argument, what is it good for? You can speak only in Malaysia. What is important is Chinese and English because you can use it everywhere. And so they are very outgoing. They also like to find a job abroad. So it is very important. In modern times, where China became economically very powerful, Chinese also is learned by many Malays nowadays. I don't know what many means, but in education, Chinese is now of interest to other groups as well. But for sure, Malays consider Malaysia to be a Malay-speaking country. And the Chinese don't really go with that. That's how you could characterize it.
Yeah. So they are shifting their identity to Malaysian, or they try to, how do you say, they try to preserve both Malay identity and their ethnic identity.
The literature reports that the Chinese in Malaysia call themselves Malaysian Chinese. And it's very much what I see. they have a Malaysian passport. They don't exactly relate to China. But for Chinese people, ancestry is important. And so many, not all, many also can tell you where they are from in China. And in some cases, they still have relatives there, which they may visit every 10 years or so. So there is some amount of contact, but they are Malaysian citizens. You see, this is difficult to define because the word Malaysia and Malay go together, but that doesn't fit for the other groups. Yeah.
Right.
I think the Chinese wouldn't have minded a British rule. They are comfortable with that. Yeah. Whereas with affirmative action, with this new economic policy, they are actually discriminated nowadays in the country, which doesn't bother them economically too much, but it doesn't feel good. Yeah.
So that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, for other participants, we still have the time for discussion or share your work.
Do we have time until 11:30? Okay, we have plenty of discussion. So obviously I was far too fast. I didn't expect that.
Okay, can I have one more question? Because like you already mentioned about the Aslian people in Malaysia. Yeah. How about their attitudes or their, I don't know, their status in Malaysia?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, I can say more about that. Of course, I do not speak any of their languages. I don't have many insights, but we visited the area and we went to remote villages and asked them, and I also read the literature. So this is what I can tell you. First of all, they were treated very badly in history. They were enslaved and whatever by the coastal people, the Malays and the British and so on. For this reason, they are not spontaneously friendly with a foreigner like me when I come to their village. So they didn't smile. They were observing me. I could speak with some of the youth in Malay language. So they explained a little. The policies are such that they are Islamized by the state and that they are to move closer to the roads. So the government builds villages for the Orang Asli closer to the road, to the main road, so that they don't live somewhere in the jungle. And if they convert to Islam, it seems they also get certain advantages. So I remember one interview with a Samai woman who complained that her neighbor converted to Islam and then he got a big house. So that is the contemporary current situation. I would say they are, of course, poor. And they are selling things along the road. When you go to the Cameron Highlands, there are many such shops where you can buy baskets. I remember also canes for beating children and other products they can produce, or fruits. Yeah. In the plains, there were indigenous villages, but they were full of Malaysian flags and they spoke only Malay. They were very friendly. They look a little bit different from the Malays. So it was a different ethnic group with some Samai or Tamiar, I don't know. And they are completely assimilated culturally. Yeah. But some groups are still in the forest. Yeah.
So I mean, in the meantime, they're going to shift their identity or to lose their identity as well. Am I right?
Over time, this will happen. On the one hand, of course, this is sad. On the other hand, I think life in the forest is harder than when the village is closer to plantations. The men go to work in the plantations. On the one hand, this might erode their own culture. On the other hand, maybe they earn more money and can afford a vehicle and a better house and so on. And yeah, of course, sure, these cultures may then gradually disappear. One remarkable aspect, many, Hakkas in history, Hakka Chinese, they are often pioneers. They went into the forest in Borneo. They lived between the Chinese, Hokkien Chinese, and the Austronesian people in Taiwan. And also in a Semai village, we found a Chinese shop, and the people were Hakkas. So here again, a similar pattern. The Hakkas as a connection between the forest people and the coastal culture. Yeah. So sure, when they go to school and learn Malay and so on, I assume that they will become more Malay and less Orang Asli over time. But that's an assumption. For the moment, you can go to such villages and they live a more or less traditional life. Of course, they have a motorbike nowadays.
That's quite similar to any indigenous communities around the world that they're, I mean, the modernization and globalization, a little bit changes their life and their culture. That's normal phenomenon around the world.
Yes, and this is very much at the core of our work, but I wouldn't see it only negatively. We have all been assimilated to a culture, whether we liked it or not, but because we wanted to have this lifestyle. So I come from a rural area, but now I'm at the university in some town. I had to give up my own dialect. I'm wearing the usual clothes everybody's wearing, not some traditional clothes. And the same is true for all other groups. The minorities that we see today, they're just the last to experience that because they live in remote areas. They live in an area which is not central to the economy. I would say that's the only difference. And we have to document such cultures, I would say, as long as they are still there. So I'm very interested in reading a grammar of this language. But yes, those altogether 20,000 people in the jungle will probably not remain in this way forever.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we still have time to go. If I'm sorry for that. I must switch. I forgot to switch off the sound. Yeah. So I'm really sorry I stopped far too early. I wasn't aware of that. I thought this is plenty of material. On the other hand, this makes noise even if I switch off the sound. I'm very sorry. Cannot do. Airplane mode. Okay. Yeah, it was a course overview. I didn't want to go too much into detail. About many things I don't know much more. I cannot really tell you much more about the Orang Asli and the Kadasantusun and so on. I have seen them, that's all. I will have 2 more talks here, thankfully, to Professor Siripen. One about Malaysian English and one about Hakka in the world. So then that's why I avoided going too deeply into this here. But then I would like to show how much Malaysian English is influenced by Chinese and why by Chinese, and how even Malay, spoken Malay, in my opinion, is influenced by Chinese speakers, because it shows very Chinese patterns in the spoken language. I mentioned this book by John Newbold, 1839, this very old book. And that is online. And if you're interested in Malaysia, I think that's very interesting to read an old report, very detailed report about all the circumstances of Malaya under British rule, where one really gets a lot of information. How, for instance, the Chinese traders profited from the foundation of Singapore and in a very short while became a majority there, which of course didn't necessarily please the British. But Singapore turned out to be more interesting to Chinese trade than to British trade. And that's how Malaysia, in this geographical position, became relatively important for the world powers and became a place for Chinese settlers. And in the beginning, Malays and Chinese only lived in the coast area, first mostly in Malacca, then of course in Penang, then in Singapore. The eastern side of Malaysia until this day is poorer and doesn't have big centers. And when the British, for instance, built a railway from Kuala Lumpur and Penang down to Singapore, this was only jungle. There was no infrastructure. And so they built the railway, and every 50 kilometers or so, Chinese settlers built Chinese villages and towns, which often have or had a Chinese name. So, for instance, the town of Kulai, which means where the turtles are coming, Kulai. This still has this name to this day. Or the city of Kluang used to be a majority Chinese city first. And these are important cities along the railway south. And the country is not uniform in linguistic terms. In the north, Hokkien is quite dominant among the Chinese. In the south, on the other hand, everybody speaks very well English because they have Singaporean media. They can receive television and radio. And so they're very close to Singapore. Many people go down for work to Singapore. So in Johor Sultanate, there are many Chinese and they usually speak very good English. This may not be so much the case further north. And on the east side of the peninsula, there are much fewer Chinese and a dominance of Malay-speaking people. But also there, sometimes the businesses are owned by Chinese, and so there are few Chinese. And somebody mentioned tin mining, which led Chinese from Malacca north until Phuket in Thailand. This is the tin route where migrants moved north. And there is a second, less important route, the so-called gold route, where Chinese settlers moved across the highlands following gold until northeast Malaysia. And that's why there are a few remote villages of Chinese people on the northeastern side. I have not been in these villages, but I have talked to researchers who have done anthropological research on that. I'm now mostly speaking something to bridge the silence. If you have questions, please interrupt me.
I think that you spent like a perfect time for this talk, because like you have gone through your talk without a break. So I think that you have spent most of your time perfectly. I just would like to ask you like a small questions, like, can you talk a little bit about Hainan people in Malaysia? Have they got like influence to other Chinese ethnic, or in terms of businesses? What did they do? What do they do?
I think I must say that I'm very sorry, but I cannot really comment on that question. I know there are Hainanese, but no personal experience.
No worries. That's okay. The reason that I ask, because I am descendant of Hainan. I'm half a Hainan. Yeah. So that's why I would like to know about Hainan people in Malaysia. No worries. That's okay. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm interested in everything, but I try to do as much as I can, and we focus on the Hakkas because of my wife. He's a Hakka. So I know a bit about the Cantonese, and I inevitably meet Hokkien speakers, but Hainan, I only know there are such people. I don't know.
Yeah. No worry. Thank you. Thanks.
But then you may investigate that.
Yes.
Okay, I think we can stop now. So thank you so much, everyone, and Professor Raf. We still have 2 times public talk in the next 2 weeks. So please welcome to join us again. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest. I'm happy to have met you.
Thank you so much, Professor Raf. Thank you. Thanks.